So moving from social identity theory and basically again that understanding that our own perceptions of our strengths and our weaknesses, our personality traits, and also the groups that we belong to, our social identity, are the foundations from which a lot of how we perceive the world and how we perceive others is based. We're going to talk about some of the perceptual biases that now occur based on how human behaviors process information. And generally, we're going to focus on when we're misperceiving others. And with each one of these, we're going to talk about how they occur and what drives that bias. But we're also going to at least briefly touch on how we can kind of watch ourselves and our own behavior to make sure we don't fall prey to these biases in how we perceive others. We're going to talk about stereotypes and how stereotypes are formed. We're going to talk again about the fundamental attribution error that I already talked about a little bit in the previous module. We're going to talk about similar to me effect, which I've also discussed a little bit as we've prepared for this module. We're going to talk about selective perception, first impression error, and halo effect. And all of these are common mistakes that everyone tends to make based on simply how we cognitively process information about others, but are also very easily identified if we're looking for that. And that's one of the main things that I want to kind of bring home here, is that where these errors, where these biases tend to occur, is when we're under stress, we're under time pressure, and we really are having to make snap judgments. No matter who we are, we can fall prey to these biases, if you will, in those situations. However, if we're aware of the situations, if we're aware of these types of biases, generally we are much less likely to fall prey to them if we're not under time pressure, we're not stressed, and we're able to think through and kind of engage in a process of decision making. So one of the first things that organizations can do to try to minimize these perceptual biases is make sure that they're not putting managers or decision makers into situations where they're having to make snap judgments under stress with very little time to consider it. That's where we tend to see these biases play out at the strongest. If an organization sets up a situation where decision makers are given time to process information, potentially even training about these biases, we're much less likely to see them in actuality. So we're going to start and just briefly touch on stereotypes. The first thing to really recognize about stereotypes is when we're talking about just stereotypes, we use stereotypes all of the time, and I'm uncoupling the term stereotype from bias or anything about ethnic or gender or age groups as we often consider it. So when we're talking about those kind of stereotypes, we're also often talking about the legal considerations of how stereotypes can occur in our day-to-day dealing with individuals. But the way our brains process information is through stereotypes. If I say the word dog, each one of you probably has a different image that comes to mind. Some of you might have, actually, statistically speaking, most of you may have thought of a Labrador Retriever. That is the most common stereotype people have of dogs. But if your experience with dogs has been primarily smaller dogs, probably that's what popped to mind. If primarily you've encountered beagles in your life, you probably thought of a beagle. In my case, when someone says dog, I tend to think of German Shepherds because, again, I've had more experience with German Shepherds than many other types of dogs. So again, that's not necessarily a stereotype that is resulting in bias, but it is a stereotype. And if I treat all dogs as if they're German Shepherds, I'm now falling prey to a stereotype. So stereotypes themselves are belief that all members of a specific group, whether that group is dogs or any other type of trait, share similar traits and are prone to behave the same way. In other words, all people from group X possess characteristic Y. And stereotypes help us process an enormous amount of information, and they can be accurate in some situations. But we want to make sure that we're not relying on stereotypes, especially in organizational decision making. So some quick facts about stereotyping. Stereotyping operates automatically without conscious processing. So stereotypes are constantly being fallen back on. It's how we actually make sense of the world. Every one of us has stereotypes of almost everything imaginable, from how you picture the word house. Again, dependent on where you grew up. Was it an urban setting? Was it a rural setting? Did you live in a large house? Did you live in a small house? Some of you might have thought of actually a mobile home because that's what you're most experienced with. So again, that's just kind of talking about recognizing our stereotypes. We do find that the stronger or the more specific the subgroup is, typically the stronger the stereotype. So when I ask people to think of stereotypes of women, for instance, I'm probably going to get a large range of stereotypes, some semi-accurate, some potentially not. But no matter what, those stereotypes do not necessarily mean that any one individual of that group possesses those traits. However, if I ask you to think of female executives, not only are you probably going to have a stronger stereotype of what that means, also that stereotype is more likely to inform your decision making and potentially lead to bias. So again, it's important to remember that stereotypes unto themselves are not necessarily a negative thing. It's how we function, it's how our brains sort information. However, when we use those stereotypes to make judgments about an individual based on our beliefs about their group, that's when we can fall prey to bias. And sometimes those stereotypes might be true of the group, but no matter what, even if they're true of the group, that does not necessarily mean they're true of the individual. So we briefly talked about the fundamental attribution error, and that's attributing others' actions to internal causes, i.e. their innate traits, while ignoring external factors, the situation, that might have influenced their behavior. So basically, we're making judgments about people's dispositions, traits, and characteristics that can correspond to what we've observed their actions. In other words, when we look at someone else's behavior, we tend to attribute that behavior to their dispositions, traits, and characteristics. As I said, the reason it's a fundamental error is that we do the exact opposite when we look at our own behaviors. If we look at our own behaviors, we're much more likely to attend to the situation that we were in and how that constrained our behavior. So let's just take another quick look at how this kind of plays out within organizations and how humans function. So again, we have the behavior, what someone does. So we see a behavior. That behavior exists, we've watched it. It might be something as simple as them being kind to someone. It might be as socially undesirable as they kicked a small defenseless animal. For example, here, observe someone fall off a ladder. So now we have the attribution. Now, if we had fallen off a ladder, would we immediately jump to the conclusion that we were clumsy? Probably not. We might. It depends on our self-esteem and our own understanding of our beliefs. But there's a good chance that we might have attended to the fact, well, I wasn't used to that ladder. I shouldn't have I set up the ladder improperly. The ladder itself was rickety. We're going to look at those external situations when we think of attributing that behavior to ourselves. But when we're attributing that behavior to someone else, we observe them fall off a ladder, we assume that person has a disposition. In other words, we're making the assumption that that one piece of information gives us information not about the situation, but about the person, that they themselves are clumsy. We probably shouldn't give them tasks that involve anything dangerous. Now, I do want to again point out, they may well be clumsy, but we have a natural tendency to overestimate the information that we've gathered, the single act of someone falling, and ignoring the situation. Was the ladder rickety? Was it a unique situation? And jump to a conclusion. And that's the fundamental attribution error. It's jumping to conclusions. So again, when we're making attributions, we can make a causal attribution. And if it's internal, the explanation for that behavior is based on the actions for which the individual is responsible. In other words, it's about their traits. Are they lazy, hardworking, mean, nice, dumb, smart? And we make a corresponding inference. However, if we attend to the external, the explanations often may be based on the situation of which the individual had no control. The alarm clock doesn't work, traffic in LA is ridiculous, etc. So again, if someone showed up for late for work in LA, an internal attribution would be they don't leave themselves enough time, they're inconsiderate. An external belief might be they gave themselves plenty of time. Unfortunately, the traffic was even worse than normal and they could not have anticipated that. Now, one of the ways we can kind of look for the attribution process, the fundamental attribution error in our own behavior, is whenever we're making a quick judgment about someone based on a behavior, pause for a second. And again, I talked about the fact that these are less likely when we have time to think through and ask, were there situational constraints on their behavior that might have resulted in this? And maybe that involves just asking. So the next one we're going to talk about is a little bit more of a detailed theory of how we make attributions. And a lot of theories that come out of psychology are kind of cognitively logical theories. In other words, they're not going to explain every piece of behavior you see because some behavior is hard to explain. We often do things that don't make an enormous amount of sense. Kelly's theory is based on that idea that people are making rational decisions. And what this theory is it basically looks at three pieces of information about anyone's behavior to guess how we're going to attribute that behavior, whether we're going to give it to external causes or internal causes. And those three pieces of information are consensus, consistency, and distinctiveness. Consensus is information regarding the extent to which other people behave in the same manner as the person judged. So for instance, if we saw someone fall off a ladder, but we had also seen a lot of other people fall off that same ladder, there would be consensus. People, in general, fall off that ladder. Maybe they're not clumsy. However, low consensus would be, I see someone fall off a ladder that I've seen many other people use and no one had difficulty. That would be low consensus. We're more likely to attribute it to an actual trait. Consistency is information regarding the extent to which the person being judged acts the same way at other times. So with consistency, again, if someone fell off a ladder, but I've also seen them fall out of a chair, I've also seen them trip over the carpet, I've seen a lot of consistent behaviors that would lead me to make an attribution that they are clumsy. That would be high consistency. Low consistency would be, again, I see someone fall off a ladder, but I've never seen them be clumsy before. I've never seen them trip. I've never seen them fall before. That would be low consistency. And finally, distinctiveness, information regarding the extent to which a person behaves the same manner in other contexts. So distinctiveness basically means are they always clumsy? Are they always making mistakes? It's not just about how consistent their behavior is, it's how distinctive it is. So again, if someone was clumsy once on a ladder, but I had never seen them be clumsy elsewhere, that would be a situation of high distinctiveness. Low distinctiveness would be, again, I commonly see that behavior. So we're going to go through one more example of Kelly's theory of attribution, and obviously the book also goes into this in fairly good detail. So again, you observe an individual complaining about the food service and decor in a restaurant. The answer becomes why. So one, no one else complains, so the consensus is low. Only this person is complaining. The next one is consistency. It's high. The person always complains in this restaurant. And finally, distinctiveness. The distinctiveness is low. This person also complains in other settings. In other words, it's not distinctive that they're complaining this time. No one else complains. They often complain. And the person complains in completely different settings. In this case, our attribution would be an internal attribution. The person complains because they're difficult to please, an internal attribution. We can also walk through this a little bit differently and think, so basically, if consensus is high, yes, they're complaining, but everyone complains here. Also, the consistency is low. The person doesn't complain in the restaurant normally. And finally, the person has high distinctiveness. In other words, they're not used to complaining in other situations. So in this case, they normally don't complain here. They don't complain in other situations, and everyone else is complaining. Consensus is high, consistency is low, distinctiveness is high. In this case, we'd be very likely to make an external attribution. Wow, this restaurant really is probably worth complaining about in this particular case. It's not the person. So again, we've got that example there where several others also complain, consistency is high. The person also complains in this restaurant, that consistency is high. So the person does often complain, but the person does not complain in other settings. So in this case, we've got consensus is high, consistency high, and distinctiveness high. So in this case, only 2 of the 3 change. Still, we're probably likely to basically complain because the restaurant itself is terrible, an external attribution. So you can kind of see how these 3 factors are playing out if we're rationally trying to attribute behavior to internal or external causes. The similar to me effect is pretty straightforward. It's the tendency for people to perceive in a positive light those they believe to be more similar to them. And we find this in psychology research, especially social psychology has researched this phenomenon through multiple studies over the years. And it's found that the more similar someone is, the more likely, on average, you'll have a positive opinion of them. So this can be used to explain a fair amount of prejudicial behavior we find in various organizations, where people are in separate groups or separate ethnic groups or separate age groups, and are also therefore less similar to people making decisions. It's one of the reasons why a lot of organizations have been working hard to increase the diversity of their decision makers, and even occasionally work towards making sure that not a single person is making decisions, but a diverse panel is making decisions. It's somewhat fighting the similar to me effect. It's a natural tendency. And think about it. You probably fall prey to this a lot. When you meet someone for the first time, if you find that you have a lot in common, if you find things to discuss, you're probably going to leave that meeting thinking this was a pretty cool person. I'd like to meet them again. But if you meet someone who might be just as interesting, but they're not similar to you, they don't have the same interests, they don't come from the same culture, you don't have a lot in common, you probably have a lot less to talk about, at least initially. And similar to me effect is about that initial concept. Once you actually get to know someone, whether you're similar to them or not, and you learn how their skills and their abilities match their role, you're much less likely to fall prey to the similar to me effect. And again, we can just watch for it. When we are encountering someone for the first time that may not be very similar to me, we may want to make a little bit of an extra effort to get to know them a little better, recognizing that our natural tendency is to basically kind of move towards people that are similar to us. Selective perception simply means that we tend to focus on an aspect of the environment while ignoring others, and perception of importance is governed by the background. So what this basically means is we do attend a lot to what is going on outside of the individual. When we think of an individual, we're thinking about their personality, their traits, and who they are. But when we meet someone, we tend to attend very quickly to situational cues. Those situational cues might be as simple as how they're dressed. So someone that is very clean cut, very well manicured, and their hygiene is very good, and they're in an expensive suit, we're going to start making some assumptions about that person without knowing anything about them. Compared to if that same person was introduced to us, kind of smelly, their hygiene not as well kept, and in very shabby clothing. If we meet someone and we start to talk to them and we know that they come from a positive kind of earth first organization or they come from an offshore drilling organization, we might immediately start to make some assumptions based on that. So we need to recognize that we do tend to take into the account the situation that people are in, and we often make very quick assumptions without even realizing it about how the person is going to behave based on that situation. So again, this is something that happens very often when we're not paying close attention or we're having to make a snap decision. If I have to just choose someone with very little information, I'm probably going to go for someone that presents very well or comes from an organization that I already know and trust, compared to someone that doesn't present as well or maybe comes from an organization that I'm suspicious of. But that really doesn't tell me anything about that individual's personality, their traits, their skills, their likes. So again, this is something to watch for when we're making snap decisions. So there's also, of course, first impression error. Remember the slogan, you never get a second chance to make a first impression. Research has actually found this is fairly true. We have a tendency to very quickly make a decision about people when we first meet them. And it is called first impression error. One of the most famous studies of this actually had students who were taking a class. At the very first part of the class, they were presented the faculty member, the person teaching the class, and the person basically started their lecture and for about 15 seconds didn't actually talk. They just presented the slides and used their body language a little bit to indicate some things. At which point, the class was immediately stopped and they were asked to rate the faculty member. So all they were rating this person on was about 15 seconds of nonverbal impressions. They then took the class, 4 months of lectures, tests, quizzes, discussions, and at the end, they of course filled out their rating forms of that same professor 4 months of experience later. There was a high correlation between that 15-second rating and the rating after knowing the person for 4 months. This basically is an ideal example of first impression error. We do have a tendency very quickly to make assumptions about people when we meet them right off the bat. And we want to be very careful that we're making sure that that first impression is not influencing our understanding or knowledge of the success of that person's skills and abilities within a workplace. So again, how you present to someone. So example, the thoughts that you might have when you see this person versus this person versus this person. And again, as you saw each image, that's a thin slice. You don't know, you're not talking to the person. You might have some preconceptions from the films these are taken from or the headshots, but this is the same actor in 3 separate roles. And in each case, we probably activated slightly different assumptions about the person simply based on one, how they're being presented. So again, attending to that situation around them. But 2, we're also making an immediate first impression about the person. And we want to watch for that as well. So the tendency of first impression error is the tendency to base our judgments on others on earlier impressions, often very early impressions. And generally speaking, what happens is when we meet someone for the first time, if we make an initial impression, in other words, they seem to be an excellent performer. As time goes by, if they stay an excellent performer, one, it confirms our stereotypes, it confirms our judgments about them. And we like things being confirmed. So not only that, we're also a little more likely to try to attend to the positive because we already have a positive impression. However, if the person, again, started with a positive impression, but then over time proved that they were not as good a worker, we're actually less likely to attend to that negative behavior. And we also don't like the feeling because it's basically evidence proving that our initial first impression was wrong. We're less likely to attend to it. That doesn't mean that if you have a first impression of someone that's very positive, that you can't be broken out of this bias. We've probably all met someone that we liked a lot to begin with, and over time learned this was probably not the best person for us to hang around. But it often takes longer than it should, and we often tend to make excuses. Likewise, there's probably some people we've met that we had a very solid positive impression of initially, and over time may not have been as positive as we thought, but we still tend to think well of them as we're looking for examples that support our initial judgment. This same bias also leads to halo effect, the tendency for our overall impressions of others to affect the objective evaluations of their specific traits, perceiving high correlations between characteristics that may be unrelated. So for instance, if we meet someone and they're very charismatic, we like them. At that point, even if we don't have data or we have limited data, we're more likely to assume that not only do we like them, that they are also outgoing, that they may also be skilled, that they may also be good at sales. So the more favorable someone is perceived on any one characteristic that we have data on, the more likely we are to just assume that they're going to be good at everything else that we might want to rate them on. We especially see this in evaluations and performance management sessions, where a manager may only have one or two data points about the person, and if those are positive, assumes that all the rest are positive as well and rates the person highly across the board, when in reality, they don't really have data on those others. So again, we just want to be honest, and a lot of times a part of managerial training, especially for performance evaluations, is about halo effect. Make sure you're not giving high ratings when you don't have data. It's okay to say, I just don't have data on this particular characteristic, and we want to focus on that as well. So just a quick review again, the perceptual biases we covered include stereotypes, fundamental attribution error, similar to me effect, selection perception, first impression error, and halo effect. And I really want to stress one last time, all of us to some degree or another fall prey to these because these are basically biases that are built into how we process information. It is something that naturally happens as the fact of how our brains are cognitively structured and also our own need to be social creatures. The way we overcome these biases is to make sure we're looking for external causes, that we're using objective measures of performance, and again, we avoid having to make quick judgments. Again, stress and time pressure are the biggest things that result in us falling to these perceptual biases. Giving someone less stress and more time to think about their decisions while being made aware of these perceptual biases is one of the best ways to actually reduce them. So hopefully this gives you kind of an overview of how social identity theory then also leads to how we're making perceptual bias decisions, or we're falling prey to these perceptual biases. So I look forward to talking to you in the next module as we continue to explore these concepts. As always, if you have questions, I encourage you to use the discussion board on Canvas or feel free to email me.